After the pilots lost consciousness during the flight, a courageous 12-year-old boy found himself in control of the airplane. What he did next left everyone on board in awe and tears. As dawn broke, young Leonard Thompson, a 12-year-old aviation enthusiast, walked through the airport doors, his eyes sparkling with excitement. He carried a small backpack covered with airplane stickers and clutched his well-worn aviation manual like a treasure. His mother, Rachel, walked beside him, her tired smile reflecting pride and joy. This trip was more than just a vacation. It was the result of months of saving and hard work. At the boarding gate, Leonard's excitement was uncontainable. He eagerly pointed out planes on the tarmac, accurately identifying their models and airlines. "Look, Mom, that's a Boeing, and over there is an Airbus A320, he exclaimed with precision. Rachel, unfamiliar with aviation, couldn't help but smile at her son's passion. "You really know everything about planes, Leo. You're definitely going to be a pilot someday." When boarding time arrived, Leonard inhaled deeply and stepped onto the plane. His curious eyes scanned every detail, from the upholstery to the overhead bins. He even tried to catch a glimpse of the cockpit as they passed by. Once seated, Leonard pressed his face to the window, watching the activity on the runway below. "Mom," he said excitedly, "did you know this Boeing 737 can fly at speeds up to 560 miles per hour? Rachel adjusted her seatbelt and chuckled. "That's incredible, sweetheart. Maybe one day, you'll be flying one of these." As the plane taxied and took off, Leonard felt a thrill unlike anything else. The engine's roar, the vibrations, and the sensation of being pushed into his seat filled him with excitement. Outside, the world transformed into a sea of fluffy clouds. Once the flight reached cruising altitude, Leonard hesitated for a moment before addressing a flight attendant. "Excuse me, what's our altitude right now?" he asked shyly. The attendant smiled, pleasantly surprised by the young boy's curiosity. "We're flying at 33,000 feet. Are you interested in aviation?" Leonard nodded enthusiastically. "Yes. I've spent hours on a flight simulator, and I've learned how autopilot works and how to read basic instruments." His mother chuckled softly, impressed by her son's knowledge and confidence. The attendant, clearly impressed, responded warmly. "You sound like a future pilot. Keep it up, and maybe we'll work together one day." Before leaving, she handed Leonard a small sticker with the airline's logo, which he tucked away like a trophy. The flight continued smoothly, with Leonard absorbing every detail. He paid attention to the safety instructions, the announcements, and even the onboard meal. For him, this wasn't just a journey, it was a glimpse of his dream. However, as the plane flew over the Caribbean Sea, the calm was suddenly disrupted. A small jolt shook the aircraft, causing Leonard to sit up straight. Though turbulence was common, something about this felt different. A hush fell over the cabin as passengers exchanged nervous glances. The captain's calm voice soon came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some mild turbulence. Please keep your seatbelts fastened, everything is under control." Leonard tightened his seatbelt, trying to hide his unease. His gaze remained fixed on the plane's wing, which swayed slightly. Rachel, noticing his concern, placed a reassuring hand on his. "It's okay, Leo. The pilot knows what he's doing." Leonard nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The turbulence intensified, and the plane jolted harder. The seatbelt sign illuminated above, and the flight attendants moved through the aisle, ensuring everyone was secured. Suddenly, the aircraft shook violently, accompanied by a loud metallic noise. The murmurs of concern turned into gasps of fear. Leonard glanced at his mother, who tried to maintain a calm demeanor, but her worry was evident. The plane began to lose altitude, and the boy's heart raced. Closing his eyes, Leonard took a deep breath, unaware that he was about to face the most significant challenge of his young life. As the plane continued to shake like a leaf in a storm, the cabin was filled with tension and fear. The jolts had intensified, transforming into sudden, heart-stopping drops. Passengers screamed and whispered panicked prayers, their fear echoing throughout the cabin. Leonard gripped his armrest tightly, his knuckles white, while Rachel held his hand with equal intensity, trying to project calmness she didn't truly feel. The captain's voice cut through the commotion again, but this time, the tension in his tone was palpable. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing severe turbulence. Please keep your seatbelts fastened and remain seated." Despite the reassurance, Leonard sensed something was wrong. He remembered reading in his aviation manuals that during emergencies, pilots often maintained constant communication to reassure passengers and crew. But now, after the brief announcement, the silence from the cockpit felt ominous. Leonard leaned closer to Rachel, his voice hesitant but firm. "Mom, something's not right. They should be talking more. explaining what's going on. Rachel, caught off guard by his observation, hesitated before responding. But before she could say anything, the plane suddenly lurched to one side, triggering another wave of screams from the passengers. Without warning, the oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, swaying eerily above everyone's heads. Leonard and Rachel quickly secured their masks, the weight of the situation sinking in. Leonard's unease deepened as he glanced around and noticed the flight attendants struggling to maintain control. One moved down the aisle, trying to reassure passengers, but her eyes betrayed her growing fear. Summoning his courage, Leonard called out to one of the attendants as she passed by. "Ma'am, what's happening in the cockpit? Something's wrong, isn't it?" His usual shyness gave way to urgency. The attendant stopped, frowning slightly, and replied, "Everything is under control, sir." But Leonard wasn't convinced. "It's not," he said, shaking his head. "If it were, the pilot would be giving us updates. I've read about this. Something's wrong. I'm sure of it." The flight attendant's composure wavered. She glanced nervously toward the cockpit, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We can't open the cabin door without authorization," she said, her voice quiet but tense. Leonard locked eyes with her, his expression serious beyond his years. "If they're unconscious, no one is flying the plane. We need to check. Please let me help." Rachel interjected, her voice firm and worried. "Leonard, this isn't your responsibility. You're just a kid." Before they could argue further, the plane dropped abruptly again, sending cups and trays clattering to the floor. Passengers cried out in terror, and the shrill sound of alarms suddenly erupted from the cockpit. The chaos was enough to convince the flight attendant. Her professional mask cracked as she rushed to the cockpit door, entering the emergency override code into the panel. The door slid open slowly, revealing a horrifying scene. Both pilots were slumped over the controls, unconscious, their oxygen masks dangling uselessly beside them. Lights flashed wildly across the dashboard, and the alarms continued to blare urgent warnings. The plane was in a dangerous downward tilt, descending rapidly. The flight attendant froze, her hand covering her mouth as she gasped, "Oh my God, they're not okay?" Leonard stepped forward despite Rachel's attempts to pull him back. His eyes widened as he surveyed the scene. "I knew it. The alarms? The autopilot isn't set. We're losing altitude fast." The flight attendant looked between Leonard and the unconscious pilots, paralyzed by indecision. She pressed an emergency button, sending a signal to ground control, but the stormy weather was causing interference, delaying any response. Each passing second felt like an eternity as the plane continued to descend. "We don't have time to wait for help," Leonard exclaimed, his voice trembling but determined. "I know how to work the basic controls. Please, let me try to stabilize the plane." The flight attendant hesitated, her doubt evident as she stared at the young boy. You really know what you're doing?" Leonard nodded, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. "I'm not a pilot, but I know how to read the instruments and adjust the autopilot. It's our only chance until air traffic control can guide us." After a moment that felt like forever, the flight attendant nodded slowly, her face pale. "Okay, let's try. But I'll be here with you the whole time." Rachel, though visibly shaken, realized her son was right. Tears welled in her eyes as she watched Leonard step toward the cockpit. This was no longer the shy boy she had always known. This was someone ready to confront a monumental challenge. Inside the cockpit, Leonard's hands trembled as he took in the chaotic scene. The control panel was a sea of flashing red and yellow warning lights, and the sound of alarms was overwhelming. He swallowed hard, mustering every ounce of courage as he sat in the co-pilot's seat. The plane was in a steep descent, and the systems were clearly struggling. With help from the flight attendant, Leonard activated the radio, finally establishing contact with air traffic control. Through the static, a calm, reassuring voice came on. "This is Miami Air Traffic Control. Identify yourself and explain the situation." Leonard's palms were sweaty as he gripped the microphone. His voice shook as he responded. I'm Leonard Thompson, a passenger. Both pilots are unconscious. I'm in the cockpit, and the plane is descending rapidly. I need help." After a brief pause, the controller's voice returned, steady and encouraging. "Understood, Leonard. We're here to guide you. Stay calm and follow my instructions. You can do this." Leonard inhaled deeply. The weight of the situation was crushing. The control panel was a blur of warning lights and alarms, the constant shaking of the aircraft making even simple movements difficult. This was nothing like the flight simulators he had practiced on or the manuals he had studied. This was real. Lives were in his hands. "Leonard," the controller's voice interrupted his thoughts. "First, We need to check if the autopilot is engaged. Can you locate the autopilot indicator? Leonard scanned the panel, quickly identifying the blinking light that confirmed the worst. The autopilot was off. It's not engaged, he reported. The plane is descending manually, and we're losing altitude fast. Understood, the controller replied. Your first task is to stabilize the descent. Look at the control yoke in front of you. Gently pull it back while keeping your eyes on the artificial horizon. Don't pull too quickly, or the plane could stall. Leonard nodded, his heart pounding as he gripped the yoke with trembling hands. Slowly, he pulled it back, feeling the enormous resistance of the aircraft. The plane began to respond, but the movement caused a violent jolt that made his chest tighten. It's so heavy, he exclaimed, struggling to keep his composure. That's normal, Leonard, the controller reassured him. You're doing great. Keep it steady. Gradually, the artificial horizon on the control panel began to shift, showing the aircraft leveling out. For the first time, the steep descent slowed. A flicker of relief washed over Leonard, but he knew this was just the beginning. Behind him, the flight attendant gripped the back of a seat for balance as the plane continued to tremble. She picked up the intercom, addressing the passengers in a calm voice despite the chaos. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We are working to stabilize the flight. Although tension still filled the cabin, her words offered a sliver of comfort. Leonard glanced over his shoulder, meeting his mother's eyes. Rachel attempted a small, reassuring smile, though the fear in her tear-streaked face was unmistakable. He turned back to the controls, forcing himself to focus. The radio crackled again. Leonard, now that the descent is stabilized, we need to adjust your altitude and speed. Check the airspeed indicator. Is your speed within the safe range? Leonard quickly found the airspeed indicator. His stomach dropped when he saw the needle dangerously close to the red zone. The speed is too high, he said, his voice rising slightly. How do I slow it down? Look to your right for the throttle levers, the controller instructed. Slowly pull them back to reduce engine power. Make smooth, gradual adjustments. Reaching for the throttles, Leonard carefully pulled them back. The vibration of the plane began to ease as the airspeed started to decrease. He exhaled a shaky breath as a small smile crossed his face. It was a glimmer of hope amid the chaos. Suddenly, a new alarm blared. A flashing red light indicated a pressurization issue. Miami's calm voice cut through the noise. Leonard, we're seeing a pressurization alert. Check if the automatic pressurization system is active. Leonard scanned the controls, finding the necessary switch. It was off. Quickly, he activated it, but before he could relax, the controller gave another instruction. Good, but we need to ensure the oxygen masks are functioning properly. Ask the flight attendant to check on the passengers. The flight attendant, who had been silently observing, nodded and hurried out to assess the cabin. Leonard stayed focused on the controls, sweat dripping down his face. Every movement felt like a monumental effort, but the steady voice of the air traffic controller kept him grounded. You're doing an excellent job, Leonard, the controller said. Now, let's engage the autopilot to keep the plane stable while we work on your approach. Following the instructions carefully, Leonard managed to re-engage the autopilot. For the first time since the ordeal began, the plane flew steadily. Leonard leaned back slightly, allowing himself a brief moment to catch his breath. His eyes darted around the cockpit, fully absorbing the gravity of what he had just accomplished. Grabbing the radio again, Leonard spoke, his voice trembling but steady with determination. Miami Control. What's next? What's next now? Leonard asked, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding him. The controller's calm yet firm tone came through the radio. Leonard, we need to guide the plane onto an approach path. We've coordinated with Miami International Airport, and you have priority landing clearance. I'll guide you step by step. Stay calm. Are you ready? Leonard tightened his grip on the radio, his young voice filled with determination. Yes, I'm ready. Good, the controller replied. Adjust the course. Look at the navigation panel and locate the heading knob. Set the plane to a heading of 270. This will take you toward Miami. Leonard quickly found the heading knob and turned it carefully, watching as the plane adjusted to the new course. Below him, the thick clouds began to thin, revealing the vast ocean stretching out like a chilling reminder of their precarious situation. Despite the immense responsibility weighing on his shoulders, Leonard stayed focused. The flight attendant returned to the cockpit, her face pale but composed. All passengers are safe with their oxygen masks on, she reported. Leonard glanced at her briefly, a flicker of relief crossing his face, but he knew the hardest part was still ahead. Everyone was depending on him. With the plane now stabilized and on course, Leonard pressed the radio button again. "We're ready for the next step. What do I do now?" The controller's voice came through, steady and reassuring. "Now comes the most critical part, Leonard, the landing. And you can do this. We're right here with you." Leonard nodded to himself. Though no one could see him, he needed to feel confident. He couldn't let fear take over now. His eyes sharpened as he stared at the control panel. The aircraft felt stable for the moment, but he knew it could rebel at any second. Lights continued to flash across the cockpit, each signaling something urgent, a reminder that there was no room for error. "Leonard?" The controller's voice interrupted his thoughts. "We need to do a quick checklist before we begin the approach. Tell me, are the flaps set for the initial descent?" Leonard scanned the panel, quickly locating the flap controls. He checked their position and answered, "No, they're still retracted. Adjusting now." He carefully moved the flap lever. As he did, a new red light lit up on the control panel, followed by the piercing sound of an alarm. Leonard's heart sank as he turned toward the flight attendant. His voice was shaky but controlled. "New alarm. Miami Control, something's wrong. It looks like a hydraulic system failure." The response from the controller was swift but tinged with concern. "Leonard, the hydraulic system is critical. It controls several key functions, including the flaps and landing gear. Check the secondary panel to see if the primary system is still operational." Leonard's breathing quickened as he scanned the secondary panel. His eyes locked onto the hydraulic system indicator. "The primary system is losing pressure. It's almost completely inoperative," he reported, his voice tense. The controller's tone grew more serious. "Understood. We'll need to activate the manual backup system. It's not ideal, but it will give us enough control to proceed. I'll guide you through it. Are you ready?" Leonard swallowed hard and nodded, though his hands were trembling. "Yes, I'm ready." Following the controller's detailed instructions, Leonard adjusted the controls to activate the manual backup system. While it provided some relief, he understood it was only a temporary fix. The situation was still precarious. "Control?" Leonard said, his voice faltering slightly. "What about the landing gear? It's hydraulic too, isn't it?" There was a brief pause before the controller replied, "Yes, Leonard, it's possible the landing gear won't deploy automatically. If that happens, we'll use the manual override. For now, focus on what's in front of you. We'll take it one step at a time." Sensing Leonard's rising tension, the flight attendant placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Leonard, you're doing an incredible job. Everyone is counting on you, but you've got this." Leonard nodded, though his mind was racing. He couldn't help but doubt himself. He was just a 12-year-old boy. Could he really save an entire plane? "What if I mess up?" he thought. "What if everyone—" He couldn't finish the thought. As if sensing his inner turmoil, the controller's voice broke through again, firm and steady. "Leonard, listen to me. I know this is hard. But every action you've taken so far has kept this plane in the air. You're doing an amazing job. Just follow my instructions, one step at a time." Taking a deep breath, Leonard forced himself to focus. The plane seemed to respond better after the hydraulic adjustments, though the looming issue of the landing gear lingered like a shadow over his thoughts. He glanced at the instruments and reported, "Control, course adjustment complete. We're aligned for the initial approach." "Excellent work, Leonard," the controller replied. "Now, we need to start slowing down. Deploy the spoiler to assist." Leonard quickly located the spoiler controls and deployed them as instructed. The plane's speed began to decrease gradually. The reduced vibrations gave Leonard a small sense of accomplishment, but he knew the most challenging part, landing the plane, was still ahead. Leonard located the spoiler controls and activated them. However, a new alert flashed on the panel. Reading it aloud, he said, "Partial spoiler failure. It's only working on one side." The controller responded swiftly, "That's okay. It will cause some instability, but we can compensate. Adjust the yoke gently to maintain balance." Leonard gripped the yoke tightly, carefully following the instructions. The plane shuddered more intensely, but with steady hands, he controlled the pitch and roll, slowly bringing the aircraft back to a stable position. The flight attendant, holding a portable radio, returned to the cockpit. Her face was pale as she relayed the latest report from the technical compartment. "Leonard," she said with a trembling voice, "they're telling me the landing gear isn't responding to the automatic command. It won't deploy." Leonard froze for a moment, his worst fear confirmed. Without the landing gear, a safe landing would be nearly impossible. Swallowing hard, he grabbed the radio, his voice shaking. "Miami Control, the landing gear isn't responding. It won't deploy automatically." After a brief pause, the controller replied with a calm but serious tone. "Leonard, we'll need to use the manual emergency system to lower the landing gear. The control is to your left, below the panel. You'll need to crank the lever multiple times to force it down. It's going to take some physical effort, but it will work. Can you handle it?" Leonard located the lever and immediately began turning it with all the strength he could muster. The gears groaned loudly as he cranked the lever over and over. Sweat poured down his face, and his arms burned with the strain, but he didn't stop. The flight attendant crouched beside him and grabbed the lever to help. Together, they pushed through the effort, fighting exhaustion. After what felt like an eternity, a metallic click echoed through the cockpit. A green light lit up on the panel, signaling the landing gear had deployed successfully. Leonard leaned back in his seat, gasping for breath. "Control," he said, his voice hoarse but filled with relief. "Landing gear deployed. Green light confirmed." The response came almost instantly, filled with a mix of pride and relief. "Outstanding work, Leonard. Now let's focus on the landing. You've come this far. You're almost there." Leonard closed his eyes briefly, taking a deep breath to calm his nerves. He knew the hardest part was still ahead, bringing this massive aircraft safely to the ground. The tension in the cockpit was thick as he gripped the yoke again, his focus shifting to the instrument panel. Outside, the once clear blue sky had been swallowed by dense clouds, leaving visibility near zero. The radio crackled again, and the controller's voice came through. "Leonard, you're approximately 5 minutes from the runway. The weather isn't favorable, but the airport's approach systems will guide you to align the plane. We'll do this together." Leonard nodded, even though they couldn't see him. Adjusting the controls as he'd practiced in simulators, he felt his palms sweat, but he didn't let his grip falter. Somewhere behind him, he knew all eyes on the plane were figuratively fixed on him, even if he couldn't see them. The flight attendant returned to the cockpit, her expression serious but resolute. "Leonard, the passengers are silent. Many are praying. They believe in you." Leonard swallowed hard. "They believe in me." The thought was both overwhelming and empowering. He turned back to the radio. "Control, I can't see the runway. The navigation system is guiding me, but the wind is strong, and the plane is shaking a lot." "Understood, Leonard. We're fine-tuning the approach signals to help you align with the runway. Remember, trust your instruments. Don't try to look outside, focus on the panels and follow our commands." Suddenly, a violent gust of wind struck the plane, jolting it hard. Leonard's hands tightened on the yoke as the artificial horizon wavered on the screen. Pouring all his concentration into stabilizing the aircraft, he called out, "Control, the wind is pulling us left. What do I do?" "Correct gently with the yoke," the controller instructed. "Use the rudder pedals to maintain balance, but don't overcompensate. Make slow, steady adjustments." Following the instructions carefully, Leonard adjusted the plane's course. Every move felt like a battle, but he refused to let go. He knew the runway was ahead, even if it remained hidden in the thick, ominous clouds. Each adjustment brought them one step closer to safety. The radio buzzed with steady guidance. "Leonard, you're almost there. The runway will appear in just a few seconds. Reduce your speed to 155 knots and set the flaps to 30 degrees for extra lift." Leonard followed the instructions with precision, pulling back the throttle and adjusting the flaps. A new warning light blinked on the panel, but he ignored it, keeping his focus locked on the essential controls. Suddenly, the thick clouds began to part, and the glowing runway lights emerged in the distance, their brilliance cutting through the darkened sky. Leonard's heart pounded. "Control, I see the runway," he announced, his voice a mix of relief and rising panic. "Excellent, Leonard. Now focus on alignment. Keep the nose of the plane slightly elevated. Gradually decelerate as you approach the ground. Remember, touch down with the main landing gear first," the controller instructed calmly. The aircraft hurtled toward the runway, the shimmering lights acting as a beacon. But the strong crosswinds made the descent treacherous. Leonard gripped the yoke with every ounce of strength he had, fighting to keep the plane steady. The controller's voice continued to guide him. "Leonard, you're well aligned. Reduce your speed to 125 knots and prepare for touchdown." The next few moments felt like an eternity. Leonard could feel the plane descending rapidly, every nerve in his body urging him to stay composed. His hands trembled, but he kept the nose slightly elevated, as instructed. Then it happened. The main landing gear struck the runway with a jarring thud, and the entire aircraft shuddered violently. For a split second, Leonard thought he had made a mistake. But the controller's reassuring voice broke through. "Fantastic, Leonard. Now decelerate. Use the thrust reversers to slow the plane. You're doing great." Leonard pulled the thrust levers, engaging the reversers. The deafening roar of the engines slowing filled the cabin as the plane hurtled down the runway, gradually losing speed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the aircraft came to a complete stop at the end of the runway. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, an eruption of cheers and applause broke out in the passenger cabin. Crew members and passengers alike were overcome with relief, tears streaming down their faces. Leonard released the yoke, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He was panting, his body and mind exhausted from the ordeal. The flight attendant placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice filled with emotion. "You did it, Leonard. You saved everyone." The radio crackled to life again. This time, the controller's voice carried a tone of pride. "Leonard, the entire airport is on its feet. You're a hero." Leonard didn't respond right away. He stared out at the now still runway, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He was just a 12-year-old boy, but at this moment, he had achieved something unimaginable. Emergency vehicles with flashing lights surrounded the plane as its doors were opened. Firefighters, paramedics, and airport staff rushed to assist passengers, guiding them down the stairs. Outside, a thunderous wave of applause filled the air as rescue teams and airport staff celebrated the miraculous landing. Leonard remained seated in the cockpit, still gripping the controls as if he needed to guide the plane further. The flight attendant knelt beside him, gently touching his shoulder. "Leonard, it's over. Everything is okay now. You were incredible." He finally let go of the yoke, realizing his fingers were numb from holding it so tightly. His voice cracked as he spoke, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I didn't want anything bad to happen to my mom, or to anyone." Rachel was one of the first passengers to disembark. The moment she saw Leonard, she ran to him, wrapping him in a tight embrace. She sobbed with relief, holding her son close. "My son, my hero. I was so scared, but I knew you could do it. You're so brave." Leonard hugged her back, but he still felt like he was trapped in a surreal dream. What he had done seemed impossible to comprehend. As mother and son descended the stairs, the applause grew louder. Firefighters, paramedics, airport staff, and even passengers from other flights had gathered to honor the boy who had saved everyone. Leonard's face flushed as he looked around. He had never liked being the center of attention, and now he wanted nothing more than to disappear into the background. But that seemed impossible. Among the crowd, reporters surged forward, their microphones and cameras pointed at him as they bombarded him with questions. "How did you manage to fly the plane? What was going through your mind during the landing? Do you want to become a pilot someday?" Leonard turned to his mother, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Sensing his discomfort, Rachel stepped in. "Please, he's just a child. Today, all we want is to rest and be thankful we're alive." The crowd respected her words, parting to make way for them. Leonard's eyes caught sight of the air traffic controller who had guided him through the ordeal. The man stood near the paramedics, his expression a mix of pride and admiration. The man, a gray-haired veteran air traffic controller, greeted Leonard with a warm smile. "You did an extraordinary job, kid. Honestly, I think even some seasoned pilots wouldn't have handled it as well as you did." Leonard shook his head modestly. "I just did what I had to do. I'm not a real pilot. I just know a bit about planes because I like learning about them." The controller placed a reassuring hand on Leonard's shoulder. "That's more than enough, Leonard. You saved so many lives today. Never forget that." In the days that followed, Leonard's story spread like wildfire. Newspapers, TV channels, and social media were flooded with headlines about the kid pilot who had saved an entire plane. Overnight, Leonard became a global sensation. However, he shied away from the limelight. Whenever reporters reached out for interviews, he politely declined, choosing instead to spend time with his mother and return to his simple life. The airline, deeply grateful for his bravery, honored Leonard and his mother, Rachel, with a lifetime of free flights. During a special ceremony held in his honor, they presented him with a miniature replica of the very plane he had landed. The polished model bore an engraved dedication that read, "To our young hero, who showed the world that even the impossible can be achieved." Leonard accepted the gift with a shy smile, but the recognition wasn't what mattered most to him. What truly stayed with him was the realization of something he'd always known deep down: he wanted to become a pilot. As the weeks passed, Leonard became even more determined. He threw himself into his studies, dedicating countless hours to learning everything he could about aviation. He spent evenings on flight simulators, eagerly read through aviation manuals, and asked endless questions to the pilots who visited him, curious to meet the young prodigy. What had once been a fascination had now evolved into a life's calling. One quiet night, Leonard gazed out at the starry sky from his bedroom window. His mind wandered back to the day he had guided the plane to safety. In a soft voice, as though speaking to the stars themselves, he said, "One day, I'll fly a real plane. But next time, it won't be in an emergency. It'll be my job, my life." Standing in the doorway, Rachel overheard her son's words. She walked over and sat beside him, her smile warm and full of pride. "You've already proven you're capable, Leonard. What happened that day was just the beginning." Leonard looked at her and smiled back, her encouragement filling him with confidence. Deep inside, he knew she was right. That terrifying yet transformative experience had set the course for his future. The true landing he dreamed of was still ahead. The day he would take off as a licensed pilot and live out the dream that had once saved so many lives. As Leonard stared back up at the night sky, he knew one thing for certain. The journey he was about to embark on wasn't just about flying. It was about fulfilling his purpose.